Hey everybody, should the 8th commandment in Exodus 20 verse 15 be translated, "You shall not kidnap"? And also, does this have relevance to the debate about whether or not the Bible condones slavery? So to begin with the first question, Exodus 20 verse 15 in the Hebrew reads lo tignov, and the verb there, the verbal root ganav, just refers generically to stealing. So this can refer to kidnapping. It can also refer to property theft. So most scholars would tell you that there's not a good case to make that in its original context this was intended to refer specifically to kidnapping. The root ganav can refer to kidnapping specifically, but usually the context has to indicate that. For instance, you have to provide a direct object, steal a person. And that's not there in Exodus 20 verse 15. It's not there in Deuteronomy 5's own version of the Ten Commandments. It's not clarified in any of the summaries of the last half of the Ten Commandments that we find in Leviticus, that we find in Jeremiah, that we find in Hosea. There's nowhere in the Hebrew Bible where that is indicated. And we also have other legislation that explicitly prohibits kidnapping, and we're going to come back to that in the part about slavery. But how does this kidnapping reading arise? In the Greco-Roman period and then into the Rabbinic period, we have more systematic hermeneutical frameworks being applied to the text in order to allow readers to be more consistent and more confident in their readings. And one of these principles in the Rabbinic period is referred to as Devar halamed me'inyano, which means something like the thing interpreted from its context. The idea being that the immediate context, if there is ambiguity, must play a decisive role in how we interpret the text. And so when we look at the 6th, the 7th, the 8th commandments, the first two are capital offenses. They merit the death penalty. And so it seems more likely that the 8th should also be a capital offense rather than something that could refer to something that does merit the death penalty as well as something that does not. And so folks who impose that interpretive framework come up with that reading. That's why this was something that was popular at the very end of the 2nd, 1st century BCE and then into the Common Era, and that's why that is the most common reading in rabbinic literature. But when we look in the commentaries, most scholars say that that wasn't what was originally intended, and not just non-Jewish scholars. We have folks like Nahum Sarna in his own JPS commentary on Exodus pointing out it's very unlikely that this originally referred specifically to kidnapping. So does this have any relevance to the debate about whether or not the Bible condones slavery? A lot of people will point to two passages and as an indication that the slave trade itself was prohibited, and so slavery must have been prohibited. One of those passages is Exodus 21:16, which prohibits kidnapping for sale for enslavement. Now the problem with this is that this commandment within the covenant code is drawing from the laws of Hammurabi from probably over 1,000 years earlier. And in that code, this very clearly refers to kidnapping a free-born person, a citizen. And we can assume that that is likely what's going on here because we have a very similar prohibition in Deuteronomy 24, verse 7, where it explicitly refers to kidnapping an Israelite for the purpose of selling them or enslaving them. Now, even if that does not refer to native Israelites and therefore not to foreigners and others, this doesn't prohibit the slave trade, because the slave trade, as it was endorsed and condoned within the Bible, within Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46, refers to buying slaves from the nations around Israel. And so already the slave trade is facilitated by getting people from outside Israel. So nobody is being kidnapped by the individuals engaged in the transmission of slaves within Israel. And so there's no reason to think that Exodus 21:16 in any way prohibits the slave trade. We've already got other passages in Exodus 21 itself, which regulate slavery, and more specifically slavery involving Israelites, so debt slavery. But chattel slavery is also regulated as well, and we have its explicit endorsement in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. So a prohibition on kidnapping in order to sell into slavery does not in any way, shape, or form indicate that slavery was prohibited or was frowned upon at all. All that was frowned upon was kidnapping Israelites to sell them into slavery, because that was prohibited. Now, when we go forward to the New Testament, we see a very similar thing in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. We have kind of a summary and expansion on the Ten Commandments. It's expanding because it's going beyond what the original Ten Commandments said. So, for instance, the commandment is, "You shall not commit adultery," but we see in verse 10 that the author of 1 Timothy is referring to people who are fornicators as well as arsenokite. So that's a word we know from 1 Corinthians 6 that probably refers to a man who takes the active role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. So this is expanding on the prohibition on adultery in the Ten Commandments. And then there's a reference to men stealers, which is a word that referred to people who kidnapped other people in order to sell them into slavery. So just as with Exodus 21:16, this is not a unilateral prohibition on the slave trade entirely. This is a prohibition on stealing citizens, stealing freeborn persons. And if you look at the use of this word in other Greco-Roman period literature and other Hellenistic texts, it very clearly has to do with citizens. So people who are already slaves, people who have been purchased as slaves from other nations, are totally irrelevant to this law. This law has no bearing on those folks, and so it has no bearing on the slave trade in general. And so while Exodus 20 verse 15 was read during the rabbinic period as a reference to kidnapping, that is unlikely to be what it was originally intended to mean. And while some people make the case that Exodus 21:16 and 1 Timothy 1:10 prohibit the slave trade and therefore demonstrate that the Bible does not endorse, allow, or condone slavery, those arguments fall apart once you look at the context.